Welcome to the Orthodox West Gazette, a miscellany of talks, interviews, ponderings, and presentations. I'm Stephen Brannen, and today I have the great pleasure of talking with Father David McCready, pastor of St. Columba Orthodox Church in LaFayette, Colorado. Kicking off a series of interviews with some of our priests in the Antiochian Western Rite Vicariate, Father David was good enough to let us get to know him a bit and share some of his unique personal history and experience. Father David, thank you so much for taking the time to join me and talk a little bit about your background and your current ministry at your parish. I wanted to just ask if you could let everyone in the Western Rite, everyone listening to this who may not have had the privilege of meeting you like I did at the last conference, get to know you a little bit. So if you wouldn't mind just talking a bit about your background, where you come from, and how you ended up in your current ministry.
Well, Stephen, thank you very much for having me, and I'll try to answer that question as briefly as I can. So I was born back in the last century in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and I grew up as an Anglican. And as I was growing up, Anglicanism was in a state of crisis. And the crisis of the time was the ordination of women, which was symptomatic of something more deep, which was a crisis of authority. Where is authority located in the church? And so I thought Anglicanism has no authority. There is no authority. And so I looked for something that had authority, and I looked very hard at Orthodoxy at that time. But Orthodoxy at that time was very ethnic. It was very Greek. If it was a Greek church, it was very Russian. If it was a Russian church, and there was no way for me to fit in. So I became a Roman Catholic. The clue is in the title Catholic, in the word Catholic, which means universal. And I was a Roman Catholic layperson, and then I was a Roman Catholic priest. And for a long time, until the 1990s, 2000. And 2000, the millennium, which is now so long ago, was for me a time of reassessment. And then I decided to return to Anglicanism, which I did. And this brought me to America, where I joined a continuing Anglican church. But also it brought me into contact with Western Rite Orthodoxy. And having found Western Rite Orthodoxy, I found a pearl of great price. I found that I could be Orthodox, but also have my Western tradition. And this to me was the greatest joy.
I have a similar sentiment. I think many people who have come into the Western Rite of the Orthodox Church, especially those who have entered the Orthodox Church by the Western Rite, I think probably had a similar thought process. And with all of the merits and joys of worshiping in the Eastern Rite, there are equally merits and joys of the Western Rite, and to have to abandon those forever is a tough call for those who have been deeply steeped in it. So I think your story probably resonates
Yes,
with many.
I have to say that if I had been one of St. Vladimir's emissaries, the history of the church would have been quite different, because I would have opted for the Roman Rite over the Eastern Rite, I have to tell you. So there's a quotation I always think of from Newman in Loss and Gain, and he says, "There's nothing so thrilling, so piercing, so consoling as the Mass as it is amongst us." And that's a phrase I do often think of, because that is absolutely my experience of the Western Rite.
What are some of the things in particular about the Mass, about the office, about the broader Western tradition, do you think are so compelling?
I think it's the historicity of this liturgy. So there's another quotation. I'm a man for quotations, but there's another quotation by Dom Gregory Dix towards the end of his Shape of the Liturgy. And he says, "I did this," referring to the commandment of the Lord, "do this in remembrance of me. I did this with a set of words which has barely changed since Augustine brought the liturgy from Rome in 597. And it always strikes me how this liturgy is so ancient. This liturgy is the work of the saints, quite literally, the work of the saints and has sanctified so many people over the ages and brought them to heaven. And one of the things I sometimes think is if St. Leo or St. Gregory or St. Patrick or any of our great Western saints, if they were to come through the doors of St. Columba's, especially on Saturday I have Latin Mass, if they came through the doors, they would instantly feel themselves at home. So on the Latin Mass, I would turn around and say, Dominus vobiscum, and they would answer immediately by saying, Et cum spiritu tuo. They would recognize this Mass as the very Mass which they themselves had celebrated and by which they themselves were sanctified. And of course, there are slight variations, but these are very accidental. They might be surprised to see a biretta, they might be surprised to see 6 big candlesticks, and the rubrics may have changed, but the rubrics enhance what they taught. So St. Gregory says in the dialogues that the liturgy is the conjunction of heaven and earth. It's a very commonplace thing for the fathers to say, Eastern and Western. And all that we do in the liturgy, is centered on this fact that Christ our God to earth descendeth our full homage to command. So that's why we have all the incense and the gestures and the prostrations. These enhance and confirm our belief that our Lord Jesus Christ is truly present in our midst, as truly present in the sacrament as he is on the altar of heaven. And just as a kind of aside, sometimes Protestants say, oh, your worship is not very biblical. Well, I say, well, actually, read the book of Revelation. And if you read, for example, Revelation chapter 8, and you wanted to draw a picture of what you see written there, you would draw a picture of Orthodox worship, not least of all our Orthodox worship in the Western Rite, the chants, the prostrations, the incense. All these things are profoundly biblical and profoundly historical. They are part of the tradition of the Church, by which, as I say, thousands, millions have across the centuries been sanctified and brought to salvation.
I love that. The proof is in the pudding,
It
as it
is,
were.
yes, yes.
It actually works.
It does,
Um,
it does.
and yeah, I think that's a compelling enough reason. Like Adam Gregory Dix
Mhm,
can dig into um, how the elements were put together,
mhm,
how they developed, and maybe conjecture about why it
mhm.
works. But at the end of the day, the Western Rite, it just works. It
Just
it
works, exactly
sanctifies
right, yes.
people.
And
It connects people to God.
sometimes people say, oh, well, it's just an experiment, it's just this and it's just that. But my argument is this, that if the Western Rite brings one person to salvation, it's worth it. And it's brought many, many more people than just one to salvation. And that's something you can't argue with.
That's beautiful. So you mentioned at St. Columba, you on Saturdays are celebrating the Mass in Latin.
Mhm.
Are the same parishioners coming on Saturdays, on Sunday? What does that service look like, and how is it different from?
Yes, that is a very interesting question because I started this mass A because I like it and B because I wanted to attract disaffected Roman Catholics. And hitherto I have had no disaffected Roman Catholics. But what I do have is a constant stream of people from the Eastern Rite who are interested in the Western Rite. And they come for the Mass and they stay for the fellowship. And we have the most wonderful fellowship. We talk 1, 2, 3 hours maybe about spiritual things, about liturgical things, about theological things. And that is a great joy to me. And it's also a great joy for me to interact with these parishioners from the Eastern Rite. And one of the things about St. Columba's is that we have some quite fluid boundaries. So we have our members, they're written down on the list. They are come on Sundays, they contribute in these things. But very often we have people, and especially on Saturdays, but also on Wednesdays, we have people who come from other churches simply because they like the Western Rite. They're
Hmm.
Easterners, they're attached to that tradition, but they also like to share with us the joys, as you, I think, described them, the joys of the Western Rite. So the people who come on Saturday are, in general, not parishioners, but they are people who are interested in the Western Rite while retaining their allegiance to the Eastern Rite.
And how long have you been in Colorado? at St. Columba's?
So I've been coming up for 5 years at St. Columba's. I've been in Colorado slightly longer than that. In fact, much longer than that. I spent 7 years as an Anglican priest up in Estes Park before coming down the mountain, so to say, and starting at St. Columba's.
Okay. So 5 years on. What is life like at St. Columba's?
So we had a somewhat rocky start because my arrival more or less happened at the time when COVID appeared. And this caused a great deal of trouble and distress in the parish. There were maskers and non maskers, and we had ordinances from the local government and the metropolitan said, oh, you must obey, as St. Paul says, as St. Peter says, you must obey the civil authorities. And people said, no, we must resist the civil authorities. So it was a time of great turmoil and distress. And at a certain time, we weren't allowed to have more than 3 people gathered together. So I think my first Holy Week was the most sad, sad thing that we had myself and another priest and a subdeacon going through the beautiful rites, normally beautiful rites of Holy Week, and broadcasting this on the internet. So that was a challenge which, by God's help, we overcame, only to be greeted by another challenge. So one day I looked out of the window and I saw running across our grounds a series of stakes driven into the ground. And someone said, oh, that must be the council. Maybe they're laying a water pipe or something. So I rang up the council and said, what's happening? They said, oh, we meant to tell you, but the letter got lost. We sent it to the wrong address, that we're going to seize a large portion of your land by eminent domain. And they did. I mean, obviously they paid for us for it, but that also was a time of trial in that we weren't sure if we could continue where we were or if we would have to move. And we had all kinds of ideas. What should we do? Can we pick up the church and move it? Can we move somewhere else? I think we looked at every possible and conceivable idea before deciding that what we're going to do is stay put. We can stay put and probably, God willing, thrive where we are. Because where we are also, there's a lot of construction going on. So there's houses being built behind us, there's houses being built next to us, and we have the potential to be a community church.
Mm.
So God willing, we will expand our temple and also build a parish hall, which can also be used perhaps for community events. So having been faced with a number of quite difficult challenges, I think we're coming out with God's help on the other side, and we have a clear vision of how we would like the future to be.
Praise God.
Praise God
That's
indeed.
that's wonderful. Um, I may not have escaped all of our listeners
Mhm.
that yes, your accent is
Mhm.
slightly different than
Mhm.
probably many of your parishioners there
Mhm.
in Colorado. In having your life and training and early experience in the British Isles, and I believe you said in France
Mhm.
for a
In
while.
Germany, yeah.
Uh, have you found that any of that experience has been sort of uniquely useful to you in your ministry and ability to speak?
So I often say to people that I feel the doctrine of providence is not only a doctrine, but something I've experienced in my life. I feel that everything that has happened to me hitherto has in many ways been a preparation for this ministry here. And that's really in terms of the liturgy. So I don't think specifically living in England or Ireland or Scotland or any of the European countries and living in America is very different. I ministered in all those countries. And it's, ministry is ministry wherever it is. But what I have brought with me and what God has given to me is to drink deep of the well of liturgical tradition. And that's what I have brought with me. I mean, I'm not saying that liturgical tradition didn't exist in America, but I really drank from the well springs in the old countries.
Mm. As growing up in a non-liturgical Protestant
Hmm.
tradition, um, some of my earliest encounters with a liturgical tradition were almost uh, they were associated with my imagination
Hmm.
of, you know, old
Hmm.
cathedrals
Hmm.
and college chapels
Hmm.
and stone archways, rows of candles, gold vestments, and all of that to
Hmm.
me, as an American, was sort of the aesthetic appeal. Almost was one of the first things that sort of opened my heart and
Hmm.
imagination
Hmm.
to not being overly skeptical
Hmm.
of liturgical worship in the first place at all.
Hmm.
So I think even still in America, the connection to not just the liturgical past, but also the geographical,
Hmm.
history of where our Western
Hmm.
tradition came from, had roots, grew up, and
Hmm.
flourished, is still a powerful thing. So I think it's I mean, some of the places you said that you studied, St. Andrews
Hmm.
in Scotland, and I believe you said you were were you at the Abbey of Saint-Auxerre?
I was,
Is that
yes,
where you said
yes,
you were in
I
France?
was there.
Okay, yeah.
When I say that, that's not strictly true. I lived in Auxerre, which is just down the road from the great monastery of Saint Madeleine um, of Vézelay. But as you say, funny enough, all those churches are medieval churches and early medieval churches. And there was, now you mention it, there was that kind of romantic, in that sense, romantic
Mm,
link. But it's not like so much that is romantic. The reality is sometimes somewhat different. So one thing,
right.
plumbing, for example, but also I remember one day going into church. Actually, this was in Germany, and I put my hand in the holy water stoup, and the water was frozen. So
Oh boy.
it was a cold experience sometimes. But yes, I think also there is that physical connection with the past. That in fact, the Mass we celebrate and I celebrate in my very modern church, 30-year-old church, is actually the Mass which was celebrated in these ancient cathedrals and the churches which sometimes go back to very early times. So there is that physical connection, you're quite right.
Yes, it's not purely romantic
Mhm.
because there's an ongoing physical
Yes, exactly right.
continuity.
Yes, exactly right.
So our vestments are very
Mhm.
liturgies.
Mhm.
The accoutrement, the
Mhm.
our censers, and it's just everything we see. And sometimes we have to very intentionally make choices to build our the architecture of our churches
Mhm.
in ways that keep us connected. It's not as automatic anymore.
Mhm.
We have to do this a little intentionally, but I think it's so valuable in more ways than just the content of the words. We're very embodied, and so the sights, the smells,
Mhm.
the taste, the actions, the environments in
Mhm.
which we move, all of that is important to us, and I love that worship in my church week by week is connecting me to my ancestors
Yes.
come from,
Mhm.
where our language,
Mhm.
comes from,
Mhm.
where our culture, by and large, today was born and comes from. So I never take our Western Rite for granted. I appreciate it
Yes.
regularly,
Yes.
frequently.
Yes. There's something I just wanted to add to that. That my predecessor in Columbus, who founded the parish, was an academic. He taught for a long time at, funnily enough, a Jesuit college, Regis University in Denver. But one of his specialities was early church architecture, medieval church architecture,
Mm,
early medieval church architecture. And it was his desire that St. Columba's, in its very structure, should not be a replica. He didn't want that. It wasn't a museum piece, but he wanted to be inspired and was inspired by those churches of the early medieval period. So again, if St. Augustine and St. Gregory and all these other people were to come to the church, it wouldn't just be the liturgy, which they would appreciate and recognize, but I think also the very structure of the church, as you say, would be something they would recognize.
Yes, it's very holistic. I
Mhm.
think that's important for folks to understand. We're not
Mhm.
just praying a certain set of
Mhm.
prayers that come from one missal
Mhm.
versus another
Mhm.
missal. It's a holistic way
Mhm.
of
Yes.
worshiping. Everything fits together
Mhm.
and works together. And you could argue that the effectiveness, the proof of the
Mhm.
pudding, is because of that holistic working
Yes.
together of
Yes.
liturgy, of architecture,
Mhm.
of custom,
Mhm.
tradition, devotion. So, what in your mind would be some of the hopes that you have for St. Columba's moving forward, and if you have any hopes or thoughts for the Western Rite in America specifically moving forward?
Yes. So for St. Columba's, my hope is, my vision is, as I say, that we can expand the worship area and also that we can have a fellowship hall and thus increase our ministry. I think every pastor in the Christian world wants to have a huge full church, but I think also there's a limit to what is effective. I'm not sure we're going to reach that limit, but let's say between 80 and 120 people is, I think, the best limit or the best number you can have before you need to think about another parish or another mission. So for one time I worked in a parish of 3,000 people, and this was a Roman Catholic parish. And the people who went, for example, to the Sunday or for the Saturday evening liturgy had no idea who the people were who went to the 10 o'clock mass on Sundays. And there were five masses, six masses, something like that. And you lose that sense of community. So you need to guard those two things. You want to have as many people as possible without losing the sense of family, which I think every church should have, and also for the pastor himself. I know of priests who you have to make an appointment. You have to make an appointment to see them, and they'll say, "Oh, 2 months from now." And I think the priest needs to be among his people. I try, and I'm not always very good at it, I try to model myself on our Lord, who says the Good Shepherd knows his sheep. And I think it's very important for the priest to mix with the people, to meet with the people, not just say, "Hello, how are you?" on a Sunday morning, but actually to get to know them and to be their father. I take very seriously the idea that the priest is the father who loves and knows and God willing helps his children. So I do want our congregation to grow. That is my idea. I do want to make our worship space even better. I have some ideas about how the altar should be and how the sanctuary should be. I want to expand the sanctuary so that we can fulfill the liturgical fullness, or we can find the liturgical fullness of our rites, which are at this present time constrained by space. So that's my view for St. Columba's itself, that we expand and grow, but only to a certain limit. But if we're doing that, I think we will have done well. So that's my short-term goal, anyway.
Hmm.
You ask about the Western Rite, and you did say specifically about America. However, one of my great desires would be for the Western Rite to expand beyond the archdiocese, because there's a crying need for it. There are, and I think other priests, I know other priests receive messages from people, and I receive messages from people saying, "Oh, we want to establish a Western Rite. What would she do? What should we do?" And I said, "Well, I can't help you because you would have to be in America." But for example, I was talking to somebody from Japan. I was talking to somebody from Africa. They want to establish a Western Rite. So my great desire would be for the Western Rite to expand throughout the whole of our patriarchate, not just be limited to America. I do think the time is ripe for us. For two reasons, and not least of all. First of all, the state of the Roman Catholic Church is such that very often, despite the fact I don't actually get any Roman Catholics to make the move, not many anyway, I think the Roman Catholic Church is becoming less attached to tradition, and people are confused by this and maybe looking for something else. So this is perhaps a time for us to make the Western Rite more readily available. But also more generally, people are looking for God. They may not know that it's God, but they are looking for something beyond themselves. And in northern Colorado, but I think throughout America and throughout the Western world, people are turning to Orthodoxy because they are simply fed up and dissatisfied with the materialism of the world in which they live. They are looking for God, and we can give them God. And many people, of course, become Eastern Orthodox, are very happy about being Eastern Orthodox. But for some people, it is a big cultural shift and a difficulty. And we should make it as easy as possible. This is the apostolic principle, that we shouldn't lay on people burdens which are difficult for them to bear. We should make it as easy as possible for them to come to salvation. So my view is that, yes, the time is now for the Western Rite to expand and grow. And I'm always encouraging people to, they say, well, I wish we could have a Western Rite parish near us. I say, well, found it, because it's my sure belief that in many, many parts of America, one can find people who are looking for Western Rite Orthodoxy and who will support Western Rite Orthodoxy and who would find salvation in Western Rite Orthodoxy.
That's a beautiful word. I could not agree more. I think that is a wonderful vision that you're casting and a worthwhile hope. And I share it with you and hope that some groundwork can be laid moving forward at the broad scale, but also, like you said, for those who are on the ground looking for a place to worship
Mhm.
according to this beautiful tradition. May God give them the grace to found new missions and parishes, and all of us the grace to um, preach the gospel
Mhm.
to those eager to find our Lord. Um, is there anything else, Father David, that you would like to share
So
while we're speaking?
it's always a mistake to ask a clergyman if there's something more that he wants to say. So I think I'll be quiet. I think I've said all that I need to say at the moment. But I do want to thank you very much for this opportunity to talk.
Well, likewise, it has been a pleasure. I was so delighted to make your acquaintance at the last Western Rite conference that we had, and delighted that you agreed to connect with me a little bit more for the sake of sharing your story and your ministry. So, thank you very much, and may God continue to bless your ministry and St. Columba's.
Thank you very much indeed. May God bless you too.